There are very fei cars that are as radical, as gnarly, and as totally righteous as the 1988 BMW 325i. You see, I'm about 22 years old, which classifies me as a millennial. And right now, we don't have a very good rap among the whole society thing. But back in the 1980s, if I wanted to be a little bit edgy, a little bit out there, and a little bit funky, I'd be classified as a yuppie. And that is the ultimate yuppie mobile. Yuppie stands for Young Urban Professional, and they didn't have a really great rap back in the 1980s, and they certainly don't have a very good rap today, but that isn't to take anything away from the 88 325i convertible, because yes, it epitomizes a lot of what was wrong with the 80s, but it is also the perfect vehicle to symbolize everything that was so right of the decade of Duran Duran, Hungry Like the Wolf, Power of Love, and the Rubik's Cube. So in this video, we're gonna go over all the really interesting and cool stuff with this BMW 3 Series. So might as well cue the cassette tape and start the 80s. That's actually a second generation BMW 3 Series, and BMW has a lot of internal names that'll make you sound pretty cool at the car meet, so pay attention. The first generation BMW 3 Series was called the E21, then the E30, that ran from 1982 through about 1994, then the E36, then the E46, then the E90, and all you need to know about that is the E30 is kind of the classic, the pinnacle, the one that a lot of people think of as the best 3 Series ever, at least from a nostalgia standpoint. Now, one of the reasons that this generation of 3 Series is one of the most loved is because of its general construction. Front-engined, rear-wheel drive with a straight 6. Yeah, there were other engines available, but this is probably one of the most iconic. It is the M20 2.5-liter 6-cylinder. And it's super smooth, super well balanced, and it sends its power to the rear wheels like God intended. It also lives under this incredibly cool hood. Now it pops open pretty easily. There's just a latch under the dash and then you lift it up, but the way it closes is a little bit unique. So what you gotta do is hinge the hood down. It's got these little sliders that it rests on. And then you take both hands and you come up to the front and you push forward. There's a lot of cool examples of over-engineering on this 3 Series, and that just happens to be one of my favorite. Another reason people love this generation of 3 Series so much is just the design. And my favorite part, at least, is the front end. You've got these 4 classic BMW headlights with a small kidney grille in the front. It's all very square, all very angular, but it just works so well. And you also see these headlights. They're a little bit unique. They're called ellipsoids. And back in the late 80s, the vast majority of cars on US roads had these old school sealed beam headlights. They all look the same. These ellipsoids are kind of like an early version of projector beams, and they work somewhat okay today. They definitely worked well when they were new, but the inside ones, the high beams, are the real talking point. They're incredible. They're so bright. You see this car coming down the road with its high beams on, and you better put on some sunglasses because it is incredibly impressive how much light it puts out. This car also has fog lights down here that are integrated into the front end, and it really fits in with the theme. Just super square, down low. They work like they should. Okay, so behind the wheel of the E30 325i, and this is where this car really comes to life because it's just a totally magical driving experience, as they might say, in 1988, because it's so analog. It's got power steering, it's got manual seats, and it's got a cassette player. And that's all you need. And the steering is so tight, and the brakes work so well, and the engine is so smooth. It's just a joy to drive. So let's start talking about the interior just a little bit in the 325i convertible. And the first thing you notice are the seats. Now these are black leather seats, and there were a couple of different seat options available back in the day. These are the sport seats, and they are nothing short of incredible. They look pretty small, but when you get in them, you realize they actually fit pretty well. I mean, I am a pretty skinny little dude, but even still, they are really supportive and they're super comfortable. They're also really adjustable. So you of course have your recline here, which is cool, but you also have tilt, so you can tilt them back and forth. And then my favorite feature that they still do on modern day BMWs is the bolstering for your knees. So there's a little knob here and you twist it and the bolster comes in and out, which is really cool. So once you get past how lovely the seats are, you do actually have to get in the thing to drive it. And that's where a problem arises, because typically when you cut the roof off of a car, the whole thing kind of becomes jello. So you really have to strengthen it. And BMW put a lot of strengthening material down here in the sill. And you can actually see it. It's this big strip of hunky steel here. But to get in, it means you kind of got to lift your feet over this extra lip, which is a little bit harder to do than in a sedan or a coupe. But it does mean that it's pretty solid when you go down the road. Now the interior on the 325 is totally radical too, because it's so driver-centric. So you got this big plastic dashboard, but everything is angled directly toward the driver. And you can really tell that this is a driver's oriented car. You can also tell that by the steering wheel. And for some reason, steering wheels nowadays are just way too thick. And this is a pretty sporty steering wheel for the 1980s. It's not exactly thin, but it's just the perfect diameter. It's not too thick, it's easy to grab onto. There's little ridges in the back for your fingers. Now the gauges on this car are really pretty gnarly, as they would say back in the 1980s. And that is to say, they are simple, they're very direct, they're very German, and they tell you exactly what you need to know when you need to know it. Not a lot of extra design here, just a simple, straightforward gauge cluster. You have an MPG gauge that pretty much tells you your throttle position. It just gets mad at you when you accelerate hard. You have fuel, you have temperature, tach, and a speedometer. That's all you need. Now down here, you actually have a service indicator that tells you some vital information. You see, when you drive along, the lights go from green, green, green to yellow and then red. And that's an indicator to let you know it's time to bring it in for inspection or an oil change. Now we just did that on this car, but we didn't reset the indicator. So when I turn it on, it's actually yellow and says time for an inspection. But it's a pretty advanced piece of tech for 1988 and it works really well. Along the same veins as the gauges is the diagnostics computer up here, and this is probably the most 80s thing about the whole car. And you'll see when I start the engine, we have a brake light warning on. And how this works is, if I press check, all the bulbs illuminate, and when I release check, it'll tell me what has failed in the car. So you've got light warnings, you've got license plate warnings, you've got washer fluids, low beams, coolant, of course engine oil, that's a pretty big one. And the idea is there's a light that flashes here on the dashboard letting you know to check the panel to see what has failed. It's kind of like an early version of an engine management system. If I put my foot on the brake after starting it up, that brake light warning should go out, and I can tell you everything else looks fine, so we're good to drive. Next up in the weird and wacky world of BMW 3 Series is the HVAC system. And you'll notice these little sliders here, and here's how they work. You've got one slider for defrost, you have one slider for air vents, and then you have one slider for foot vents. And you can perfectly modulate exactly where you want the air to go, depending on how you want to go there and depending on the situation. So for example, if it's really cold outside and I need to defrost my windshield, BMW gives me a little cheat sheet here, letting me know I need to move the top slider to max, the fan to max, and the temperature to max. That'll defrost the windshield the fastest. Now it's really fun to kind of set the perfect position of how you want the air to be distributed. You also have an AC button here and a recirculation button here. It's a very overly complicated design here when you first look at it, but once you kind of get used to it, you quickly realize that there's nothing simpler than just telling the car where you want the air to go and when you want it to go there. Next up in the cool things of the 1980s is the trip computer, probably the most advanced piece of tech in this entire car. Now the trip computer tells you a lot of information. First of all, you've got your hour and your date, you've got your average MPG, you even have an outside temperature gauge. Imagine that back in 1988. And then an average miles per hour, and then range. So we have 183 miles of range according to the car. Now you also have some pretty scary advanced tech that would probably fail if I tried it right now, so I'm not going to, but this code button. Now, of course, back in the 1980s, people stole these cars quite a lot because they were pretty cool. And if I set my code button here, what I can actually do is establish a security code where the car won't start unless I enter the code. I'm not going to show you that right now because I'd probably screw it up and then we'd never get the car started again. I also have a timer, so I can set how long, how do I do it? There it goes. I can set the timer to start counting up, and then I can also set a miles per hour speed limit. So what that means is I can set, 100, and a buzzer will go off at 100 miles an hour letting me know that I've exceeded that established miles per hour. And these buttons along the bottom let you set the time and the date and your miles per hour limit. I wonder what the max I can set it to is. 190. So it looks like you won't be going over 190 in your BMW 3 Series convertible. Now BMW says that this car with this transmission has a top speed of about 126 miles an hour, which I imagine would be pretty terrifying. Now this is kind of an unusual button. This BMW 3 Series has a plastic rear window, but it also has a rear defrost. So you're probably thinking, what the heck, how does that work if there's no heating elements in the window? Well, how it works is you actually turn it on, and there's a set of vents in the back, and it blows hot air onto the rear plastic window via those vents. So it's a clever way to still incorporate a rear defrost into a soft top with a plastic rear window. Next up, we have the old school BMW radio and cassette player. Now, one of the cool things about it is when you turn it on, the antenna automatically deploys. It's an electric antenna, and it still even works in this car. I also have treble and bass adjustments here, and then I have an adjustment up here that lets me dictate how far back or forward I want the sound to go. So it's a pretty cool system, and actually today it even sounds pretty good. One of the cool things about this BMW are the 4-way power windows. And what's so cool about that is typically on these two-door convertibles, you'll only see power front windows and not power actuated rear windows. The rear windows typically follow the fronts, but I can actuate both by just simply pushing up or down on these little buttons. And I even have a window lockout here. It's like a little circuit breaker that if I push in, locks out all the windows automatically. That's, for example, if something blocks the window and there's too much load, it'll break the circuit before it'll break the window. Now, the keen-eyed viewers of you out there may notice that this E30 3 Series convertible is perfect in every way but one. And that's the automatic. Now, it's a 4-speed automatic, and it's not terrible, and it's pretty reliable, it's very smooth, but it's also not what these cars were known for, because for such a great driving experience, you really want that manual transmission. But in my opinion, it doesn't really matter now, because, just a few years ago, these cars were known as being, that tuner car you could tune within an inch of its life. But now they're kind of classics, and you just want to baby them and cruise them around slowly. And here is a cool bit of 80s quotage for you. Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you might miss it. The first person to get that quote in the comments section below, who said it, wins a Rubik's Cube. Well, you don't actually win a Rubik's Cube because I'm not going to buy you one, but you should go out and buy one anyways, because that's an impressive bit of 80s nostalgia. The interior in the E30 3 Series comes to hand super easily. It's just well thought out. It's very ergonomically advanced for the day. For example, these mirror controls. I mean, look, it can rest my arm here. The handle sits perfectly, and my thumb can actuate the mirror controls. But the one thing that's just terrible about the interior are the door handles. I mean, look how far back this door handle is. Total T-Rex arms just to reach it. Well, sometimes you just gotta say, what the f***? The cool thing about this generation of 3 Series is that the rear seat is actually pretty usable, and I think that's because Germans have this reputation of being quite tall, which is good when you're pretty tall like I am, about 6'1". So to get in the rear seat, I pull a lever on the front seat back. It folds forward out of the way and even slides a little bit. And then, yeah, I'm in. And this is not a huge car, guys. This is not like a 1970s Cadillac that's 25 feet long. This is a pretty small, compact car, even by today's standards. And I mean, I fit really pretty darn well. Plus, I've got this nice ledge to rest my arm on. I don't have headrest, but it's really is a great back seat. And if you're looking for a kind of fun convertible to putt around with more than one extra passenger, really consider a 3 Series. And you're probably thinking right now that rear seat looks miserable, but I forgot to tell you the best part. This seat is all the way back right now. All the way back. So I could easily move this up another 5, 6, 7 inches and that person would still be comfortable. And then I'd really have a lot of space back here. The E30 has one feature that I think all cars should have by law. You see, I hate having seatbelts that flop around in the rear seat. And check this out. Little clips that hold them in place. What a concept. Just everybody do this. I don't care what manufacturer you are. Watch this video and do that. That's brilliant. That's a really good idea. This car is pretty standard sun visors, except for one thing you'll notice. On the passenger side here, you got a mirror, but on the driver's side you don't, because this is Germany. And what are you doing looking at yourself while you're driving? You should be going down the Autobahn at 100 and paying attention exclusively to the road. Now the driver's side also had this little cubby here for holding documents and things, but that has fallen off a long time ago. There were actually a lot of different configurations of this car. There was a 2-door, a 4-door sedan, there was a station wagon, and then there was this convertible, and this is probably my favorite body style of them all. You see, I love the side profile the best, and compared to modern day convertibles, it looks exceptionally sleek. And that's because modern day 4-seat convertibles have to have headrests in the rear here and rollover protection. And yeah, that's probably a good thing for safety, but it certainly doesn't help the design when you've got these big squares sticking up above the belt line. There are a couple different ways that you'd put a convertible top up on a 3 Series depending on which one you have. This one is a manual top, which is the one you want because it doesn't have electro-hydraulic bits to fail. But to do it, there's a handle back here, and you pull the handle and this cover pops open, and it's a little finicky, but check that out. So the cover pops up, and this is where the convertible top lives. It only takes about 3 cubic feet away from the trunk compared to like a sedan, which is pretty minimal, but the top just, it's a little heavy. Oh, for God's sakes, the top just, there we go. The top just pops up like that. And then, if this hydraulic strut was working, this would stay in place. That would help a lot. I fold up the rear portion, click that into place, and then the rest is done on the inside. Now the windows have to be down for this, but all you do is grab this handle and you yank it down, and then I've got these little handles, these little levers I should say, that latch into place on both sides, just like that. And it actually tightens the top, so there's nothing you have to do back there to latch it in place. By cranking down on these levers, the whole top actually kind of stretches into position and stays pretty waterproof. Now you'll notice that there's a plastic rear window on this BMW 3 Series, which isn't actually all that brilliant in my opinion. I'd much rather have a glass one, and you can see ours is torn here. But it does mean that it's pretty light. So to put the top down, the process is actually completely reversed. You gotta undo the latches, which is pretty fast. Come on. And then you gotta lift up, release the tension on the back here like this, pull this vertical. Then there's a handle under here, the same handle you used to open the cover before. You gotta use it again to open it again. Ours is a little bit finicky. And with this rear portion vertically like this, that pops up. Now this is where it gets a little bit tricky, if I'm being honest. Because you gotta make sure the top folds correctly or you're at risk of damaging something. So you gotta do the karate chop in the rear window, and then you actually have to fold this bit in, the header bit, so it all sits properly, and you can see I didn't. So it doesn't sit properly. It's all a little bit of a faff if I'm being honest, but not as much of a faff as having to deal with an electric top that after 31 years is probably very broken. Back in the 80s here in the United States at least, there were several engines available, the most popular being the 318i, which had a 1.8 liter fuel injected 4-cylinder. This one is a pretty big engine. It's a 325i, so 2.5 liter fuel injected 6-cylinder. And you can always tell the 18s from the 25s because the 25s have dual exhausts that poke out the side here. The 18s only had one. Other things to note back here are these aluminum bumpers. Now there were actually two versions of E30. There was the ones up through 1987, and then there were the ones 88 and beyond. So this is a facelifted version, and these are a 1-year only bumper. And back in the day, they called these diving boards because they are shiny and they were huge before 87, and they could dive off of them. In 89, they went to a much sleeker design, but in 88 still has a small little diving board, and it's pretty cool actually. I mean, a lot of the old school US Americanized German cars look pretty goofy. This one doesn't. The badging on these old BMWs makes a lot of sense generally as well. You see, if you go out and buy a brand new BMW 325i xDrive, well, you're actually buying a car with a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder. But back in the day, here's how it worked. The first number was the Model 3 Series. Second number was the displacement, 25 or 2.5. And then the I here stands for injection. Now, if you got a 318i, you had a 1.8 liter injected. If you had a 325 non-I, you had a 2.5 liter carbureted. Makes a lot of sense. There was also, of course, the M3, which had a 4-cylinder, weirdly enough. But there is one exception. There was a model in this generation called the 325e. And E stands for ETA, or economy, and that actually had a 2.7 liter straight 6, which had a super low red line. But BMW, you're doing so well, and I had such a good point going on here about how this always made sense back in the day, and then you just had to put a 2.7 liter in a 325e. Now for the part you all want to know about, which is a 2.5 liter straight 6, and how's the performance floored? No. It's not all that quick, if I'm being honest, especially at a mile above sea level. 167 horsepower, right around the same amount of torque. It's not going to blow your face off, but it is super smooth, and it does make a lot of power up high in the rev range, and it does really want to rev. Now, when you floor it, there's a little kick down button on the end of the, there's a little kick down button on the end of, there it goes, end of the throttle pedal, which downshifts the transmission for you. And it really is happiest like 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 RPM. Now 0 to 60, well, to quote another 1980s movie, we'll give them another 20 minutes, but that's it. If you can get that quote in the comment section below, congratulations, you just won yourself an original Game Boy. But really, I mean, once it gets into those higher RPMs, the thing kind of hauls butt, and the MPG gauge gets pretty mad at you, but you don't care. When BMW does something, they always do it big, and I don't mean size-wise, I mean in terms of its impact on the world, its impact on the driving experience. And there are a couple things that really demonstrate that. The first is the horn, which is just the loudest thing I've ever heard. Okay, ready? Ready? For such a small car, that is an incredibly loud horn. The other thing this car does better than any other car I've ever been in is the heated seats. I've got a thermometer of truth here, and I'm gonna see just how hot the heated seats are right now. It's been out of the sun, this one cushion, so it should be about room temperature, although it is getting hot out here. Let's see what the temperature is. According to our laser thermometer, it is 90 degrees. Keep in mind it's a black seat, so 88, yeah, about 90 degrees. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn the car on, crank up the heated seats, and see what we can get it to. So here are the heated seat controls in this E30. They are completely unlabeled, but the top one's for the driver, the bottom one's for the passenger, and they're 2-position. So I flick on forward for low and backwards for high. We're gonna put them on high and see how hot they can get in just a few minutes here. I love old cars. I think they're great to drive. I think they're fun to look at. But if I'm being honest, they're not all that great to drive. And they're not all that fun to look at when they're stuck on the side of the road next to a tow truck. But what is great about old cars is the ground clearance. Now this is a 325i, it was a very sporty model back in the day, and you still have enough ground clearance to run over things like pregnant ants and speed bumps without scraping them, like modern day cars. Now this has 15-inch wheels, and they're pretty small, but you've got a big old sidewall here on the tires, so the ride is perfect. Let's talk about the trunk space. Now to get into the trunk, there's a button on the back here. And the cool thing about this 3 Series is it has central locking. So I can unlock everything from any door, just put the key in, twist it, it all unlocks. But push the button and you'll find that the trunk is actually pretty huge. I've got our camera bag back here. Fits in no problem. Now, of course, the liftover height is extremely high, but that's kind of what they were like back in the 80s. I also have a full-size spare tire, which is hidden underneath the carpet here. But once again, why can't convertibles have big trunks now? Especially hardtop convertibles, they fold into the trunk and then there's no space. This soft top folds up neatly out of the way, and then I've got all this room in the trunk for trunk stuff. So the car is turned away from the sun. They've been heating up for about 10 minutes. The heated seats here, let's see how hot they got. 130, 132, 132 degrees is what the seat cushion is now. So from 90 to 132 in about 10 minutes is pretty darn good. And trust me, when you're out in the cold of Colorado on a Sunday morning when it's like 40 out, these heated seats are awesome to have. There are two more things we haven't talked about which we need to mention really quick about these old E30s. First of all is the gauge illumination at night, which is the coolest fighter jet thing I've ever seen, in that the gauges themselves are front lit by this red glow. And the second and probably the best part of them all is what you can buy these cars for. This one is 104,000 miles, everything works in it, air conditioning works, it's all good. 5.5 grand. We just bought this one and we're gonna do a whole new series called Rad Rides around this 3 Series convertible, so be sure to stay tuned for that. But if you want to see more fun and classic cars, go back to TFL Classics, this channel where you should subscribe and check out some more fun stuff we've got coming up, because there's a lot of really cool and interesting and radical stuff planned for the summer. As always, I'm Tommy with the Fastlane Car. Go back to tflcar.com for more news, views, and real world reviews.